Good afternoon. My name is Matt Abbott, and I'm the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us via Zoom. In the interest of public health and in accordance with CDC guidelines, the Council made the decision to cancel all of our in-person public events through at least June 5th. As an institution, we are committed as ever to being the organization in Chicago that brings you relevant and timely conversations on what's happening in the world and why it matters, even if those conversations have to take place virtually for now. Please check our website and social media pages for updates, as well as for new podcasts, events, blogs, and research. And thank you to our members for tuning in. Right now, we need your support and engagement more than ever, and we hope you will keep us in mind as you help to keep nonprofits operating in this challenging time. Now, on to today's program. We'll be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on illicit economies, and we're honored to welcome Wanda Felbab-Brown to the Council's platform. This program is on the record and being recorded. After about 20 minutes of discussion, we'll incorporate questions from the audience. You can submit your questions by typing ccga.live into your browser. And before we begin our program, I'd like to introduce our guest. Wanda Felbab-Brown is a senior fellow at the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at the Brookings Institution. She's an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. She received her doctorate in political science from MIT and her bachelor's in government from Harvard. Wanda, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing today's session. I look forward to speaking with you and with those who can join online. And let me extend also my sympathies to all of us, those of us who are particularly harshly affected by coronavirus.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, to start with a very general question, how do you foresee crime and illicit economies will change as a result of this pandemic?
Well, that's a very important one that has many dimensions to it. Let me pick three and, however, preface my response by saying that we are all still adjusting to coronavirus. So is crime. Both street crime, organized crime, and the adaptations will be different in different parts of the world. Not all of them will be lasting. Some of the changes might, in fact, sped up processes that have already been underway. Others might be just temporary disruptions or temporary adaptations. We are yet to see what will be ephemeral and what will be lasting. With that, let me pick some of the obvious things that have been underway. In the developed world, in the United States, in places like Italy, where there have been significant lockdowns and people are not mingling on the streets, not going out, where there are quarantines and lockdowns, obviously street crime, predatory crime has gone away. This is true, or at least has been significantly diminished. This is true both about non-violent predatory crime and violent crime. And in many of these places, as economic activity moves online, as people are buying their daily needs, their daily supplies online, that has only pushed organized crime, criminal groups more online. None of this is new. Online fraud has been a very important feature of organized crime for the past decades. This is simply magnifying the current situation with the criminals following where opportunities obviously are. But we cannot make the assumption, and I would in fact posit, that these trends are not going to look the same way in other places. In developing countries, in slum areas, people simply will not have the option of going into self-isolation, of going into lockdowns or quarantines. For them to do so might mean starvation for them and the entire family. So they will need to continue to operate on the streets, even as that significantly magnifies the infection. That means that predatory crime on the street will continue going on. And in fact, as the global economy is experiencing a very bad downturn, this influences remittances, tourism, many other dimensions. We can even expect that in areas that are already living in poverty, marginalization, The economic downturn caused by COVID will in fact push up predatory crime, street predatory crime. So some robbers have gone away from the streets and have gone online. Other robbers are stuck on the streets with the people that are stuck on the streets. There is, of course, a new dimension to this, and that's sort of the revival of The Third Man, Orson Welles' wonderful, famous movie. The new third men are out and about, and they are hawking false products, whether it's false medications. This is not simply the case in Asia or Africa. We are seeing fraudulent testing kits being sold in the United Kingdom. We are seeing companies or fraudulent accounts pretending to be selling medications without delivering anything. This is taking as much place in the West as in the developing parts of the world. And we are also seeing hoarding and profiteering, sort of the classic Harry Lime character is of the post-World War II Vienna, are popping up around the world, and we will continue seeing more of that. This is one dimension that's likely to be quite temporarily, more ephemeral effect when global supply chains are restored, where economic activity goes back up and restrictions are no longer in place. But nonetheless, it still could be months before this change happens. Finally, let me make a comment about two illicit economies, drugs and wildlife trafficking. It is quite possible that coronavirus will cause drug droughts in some parts of the world and maybe even globally. So we are already, for example, seeing that Mexican criminal groups are starting to import precursor agents from China and India for the production of fentanyl and synthetic drugs. Similarly, as the US-Mexico border is shut down for some cargo and some personal traffic, this complicates getting drugs into the United States. Other places might be even more affected. For example, Australia might experience quite significant drug drought. Some of these will be, again, temporal. They'll ease up. Others might, however, precipitate two types of changes. One change is moving production and supply chains closer to the market. This is imminently feasible with synthetic drugs. They don't have to be produced in places like China. And criminal groups, drug trafficking groups, can simply adapt in anticipation of the future by stocking up on sufficient amount of precursor agents should a next disruption take place. But more interestingly, I would posit that this is yet another, the coronavirus and the lockdown, the global lockdown, is yet another driver of significant move toward robotization of drug trafficking. And those who can move into supplying drugs by submarines, not just semi-submersibles, but actual submarines, are going to be the big drug winners. And that's, of course, much easier to do if you're launching the submarine from the coast of Mexico and parking it in California or the state of Washington than if you are trying to do so from China all the way to the United States. The other big aspect of that is, in my view, further move toward delivery of drugs by drones, both at the wholesale level and at the retail level. At the retail level, the technologies are already out there. They have not been used very much, but the current drones that are commercially available off the shelf for very little amount of money have sufficient payloads to bring drugs to the user's windowsill. On the wholesale level, that's been more limited, but the innovations will be taking place, so payloads become bigger, and so that flight paths can become bigger. And then you can forward something like 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and we'll be in the era of not just aerial drones, but marine drones. And that's going to be a big change for both legal commerce as well as for all smuggling of contraband, including drug trafficking. And my final opening comment is on the wildlife economy, on poaching and and wildlife trafficking. There are good reasons to believe that coronavirus, the zoogenic disease that jumped from animals to people, did so as a result of wildlife trafficking. But even if it were legal wildlife trade, it's just one instance where crowded markets with wild animals in close proximity to people are the perfect breeding grounds for zoogenic diseases. Coronavirus is just a replay on a much grander, more horrible scale than what happened with SARS. So we have seen the government in China respond by banning the consumption of wild meat, but very significantly, we have not seen it to shut down all wildlife trade. And in fact, the government of China has been suggesting that bear bile is a way to cure coronavirus. This is likely bogus advice. There is no curative element to bear bile as it's been known. But it shows the enormous power of the pharmacological traditional Chinese medicine industry in China and in other parts of East Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. And so what I fear is that as the immediate horror of coronavirus goes away, the economic pain goes away, we forward 5 years down the road, we'll see exactly the same takeoff and exactly the same level of wildlife trafficking, use of wildlife potions as we are seeing now. And so 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, you'll be in the third or fourth iteration, not just SARS, not just coronavirus, but whatever the next pandemic is. And meanwhile, for poor populations in rural areas, reliance on poaching might be the only available livelihoods, whether this is parts of Africa or this is Myanmar.
Well, thank you very much for that overview. To go back and expand more on your comment about the emergence of a new third man, what about the production and sale of counterfeit goods? And on that note, President Obama's former acting administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Andy Slavitt, fairly recently tweeted out that hospitals should obtain masks and other supplies on the black market if necessary. Should we be concerned about this?
Well, there are two dimensions to it. So the disruption of regular global supply chains and production in China also means that in the short term, there is a decline in availability of counterfeit goods. China is the place where many counterfeit goods are produced. If factories are not operating and traffic is not flowing out of China, planes are not flying in and out, that means that there is an immediate shortage of counterfeit goods. Depending how long the coronavirus restrictions are in place, you could see emergence closer to home. Although I would posit it's much easier putting meth in the basement of your house. Don't do it, it's illegal and it's bad. Then is to set up a factory to be producing fake Gucci bags in the basement of your house. So there are limits to how close and how fast some of these markets can change. There is the more complicated ethical issue of when is it okay to access the illegal market for one's survival? And I would make the argument that to the extent that the hospitals face a critical shortage, it should be the responsibility of the government to source those medical supplies. Now, are governments officially going to be buying stuff from the black market? If not, if governments will say, no, we will not do it, is it okay to say that doctors and first responders will be dying, even though if you lose a doctor, you might lose 10 patients? Or are they simply going to say, okay, if you need to resort to buying from the black market, you will not be prosecuted? It's really likely the third way that it's going to head. So one dimension of it is how will hospitals, medical doctors in the developed world be reacting? Are they going to be accessing illegal black markets? Of course, in much of the developing world, those black markets are the lifeline of people already. That's how they provide for their daily needs. That's what assures their daily livelihoods. And so the more interesting question there is, how will Western governments react to the interface of criminality and survival in the context of Corona? Will governments like the United States become more tolerant of the increase of illicit crop cultivation like coca, or not? Will they continue to be completely indifferent to the humanitarian aspect? Will they become more tolerant of humanitarian actors, humanitarian medical NGOs having to negotiate access to slums with criminal groups? U.S. position has, or militant groups, U.S. position has often varied on that. For example, in the Somalia famine, the Obama administration tried to enforce very stringently laws against material support for terrorist groups, a directive that really augmented the amount of people who died from the famine, as international NGOs were scared of from operating in Somalia, where you cannot assure that some of the supplies will not leak to Al-Shabaab. Haiti and provision of economic and medical aid there after the fall of the Aristide regime and after the earthquake is another prominent space where access was constantly negotiated with criminal actors. And so will Western governments be tolerant of that on a temporary basis, or will they cling to very rigid laws that criminalize material support to terrorist groups and organized crime groups, even at the sake of terrible humanitarian objectives, really augmenting the current trend to criminalize the humanitarian space?
On that note, in areas where government control is limited, will these non-state actors or criminal groups enforce social distancing and the shutdown of non-essential businesses?
Well, that might very well indeed be the case. It's particularly true in slum areas. I have an article coming out with Professor Paul Weiss of Stanford University, in which we grapple with the very difficult situation of pandemics like COVID hitting urban slums that are extremely crowded places where social distancing is not possible. A multi-generational family of 10, 12, 15 might live in a shack. Houses are next to each other, no running water, no electricity, no refrigeration, hence no ability to stock up on any supplies and need to exist on the street. Moreover, in these places, you have no police forces, no military forces. And often the only enforcers of any kind of social rules and even of suppression of street crime are criminal gangs, criminal groups that are themselves the sources of brutality and criminality. So we have already seen in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro where that criminal gangs like Comando Vermelho and PCC have announced that they will impose a lockdown, a curfew in the favelas that they control. And they do so despite the fact that President Bolsonaro continues to delusionally dismiss coronavirus as not being a real threat. So they have taken it upon themselves to provide the governance that the government has abjectly failed to provide. And this will inevitably leave them very significantly politically strengthened. Their legitimacy will grow. In this case, they took it upon themselves. But in very many other places, like in Karachi, in Delhi, in Lagos, criminal groups might in fact, or Jamaica, might in fact be asked by governments to provide both first response and, more importantly, lockdown of these communities. This can produce terrible brutality. What if the middle class, developed rich parts of the city start seeing a decline of the virus, but the virus is still ravaging a slum of 10 million? Will governments at that point instruct criminal groups to simply shoot or eliminate anyone who tries to leave the slum? Will they in fact turn the slums into ghettos or concentration camps in ways that evoke Camus' plague? in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, it's a place where already governments essentially outsource the delivery of both law and order, or I shouldn't say law, because order is the proper term, the delivery of order and the delivery of private, semi-private public goods to criminal goods. Water is, for example, delivered in places like Dhaka, Karachi, Delhi, Lagos, oftentimes by what is referred to as water mafias. And every time governments ask criminal groups to deliver the functions, the governmentality functions that the government should deliver themselves, they strengthen those groups. So in some cases, this could have benevolent outcomes. In other cases, this could have really very discriminatory outcomes. It could, of course, be abused by criminal groups to eliminate their rivals, to strengthen the control over populations, to conduct pogroms against ethnic minority groups, religious minority groups, or outside migrants. In parts of Mexico, we are seeing the most vicious of the Mexican cartels, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, to be apparently buying up sanitizer and hoarding it. So we don't yet know what they will do with it. Is it for themselves, so their members have a higher chance of survival than members of rival criminal groups? Is it because they are becoming the third man, they will be selling it out at a higher price? Or will they, for a change, try to build political capital by handing it out to populations in areas where they live? We don't yet know how that will play in the case of this group. But one of the effects of coronavirus is likely to reshape power structures within criminal groups and between the state and the criminal gangs.
Before we open it up to questions from the audience, what advice would you give to policymakers and law enforcement agencies on what they should be doing now to mitigate the growth of illicit economies in this pandemic, and also protect those who are most vulnerable to the negative effects of illicit economies?
Several recommendations that I would make. One is that governments just cannot neglect the poor and most marginalized and just hand them over to criminal groups. This is less of a problem in a place like the United States or Italy or Europe, but it's going to be a very significant issue as COVID spreads in South Asia, in parts of Africa, in Central America. Governments are responsible for the poor and the marginalized. They cannot, even if they will need to strike hellish bargains with criminal groups, they can simply not neglect the poor. Clearly, governments will need to make very significant choices about the allocation of law enforcement. And law enforcement is likely to be significantly concentrated in urban areas and pulled out from rural areas. That means that rural areas will see likely a big upswing of all kinds of criminality. I mentioned the move of meth production back to the United States in places like Kansas. I spoke about the likely rise of poaching in rural spaces. We can be likely to see an increase in illicit crop cultivation in rural spaces. So that cannot necessarily be avoided. Nonetheless, the governments need to start thinking now about how they will respond when coronavirus is to the challenges that are being currently neglected. And one of the long-term effects, however, is that I mentioned that criminals will move toward robotization and the use of technology even at a faster rate than it's being done already. This is likely also going to apply to law enforcement, where we will see many more CCTV cameras, many more remote sensors. In some cases, those will be really good innovations. For example, water theft is a major global problem, augmented by global warming, droughts, yet very little is invested in detecting water levels. And often there are no police dedicated to monitoring that. So investing in water sensors and capacity to respond immediately is a very good response in general. And if this type of response is magnified by coronavirus, that is one good outcome of a terrible epidemic. But in other cases, this might be really bad, might be strengthening authoritarian control. We have seen China before coronavirus to be aggressively exporting its anti-crime technologies, sensor face recognition capacities, a whole package that they called safe streets, and exporting it to places like Panama, widely selling it to law enforcement forces there. I am very concerned that many of these technologies will not be accountable, that they will not be accountable between the population and the government, and that they might also provide dangerous information abroad as well. And so that dimension of greater reliance on technology for law enforcement needs to be watched and monitored and debated very carefully.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, as a reminder to our online audience, you can submit your questions for Vanda via directing your browser to ccga.live. And we'll go to one of our first online questions. What will be the impact of this pandemic on the use of digital currencies, especially as it relates to money laundering?
Well, digital currencies have been taking off before coronavirus, and I don't expect that they will be dramatically affected by coronavirus. As I mentioned, one element of it is move of technology, move of life on, and cryptocurrencies assure the possibility of safety. Now, of course, there's a tremendous amount of fraud and money laundering in cryptocurrency as well. But even before coronavirus, I have always been skeptical that the applicability is equal to all. So you can imagine a big Colombian cartel to be laundering money through cryptocurrencies and to be parking money in cryptocurrency. If you are a sicario, if you are a hitman, do you really want to be paid in bitcoins? Or do you want to have your pesos underneath your mattress or buried in your yard so that when law enforcement starts chasing you, you can grab it and run away? Many illegal economies and dimensions of illegal economies require great liquidity. And liquidity that involves levels of trust and distrust that does not easily lend itself to online activities.
Another question, how will trafficking networks be impacted now that much physical travel is severely curtailed?
Well, in the immediate term, they will be looking for production, moving production closer to the retail markets. As I mentioned, to the extent that precursor agents are available, if you can cook meth closer to the retail market as opposed to having to import it from Mexico or having to import it from Myanmar, you have a very big advantage right now. Longer term, I spoke about what I believe is robotization of smuggling of contraband, drones for retail, drones for wholesale, and eventually the move to marine drones as well. As soon as significant legal cargo, legal commodity traffic picks up, with that will traditional ways of smuggling be picked up. At the end of the day, the most prevalent form of delivering contraband is to hide it in legal cargo. But there are other interesting aspects that we haven't spoken about yet. And that's, for example, what happens if COVID starts infecting members of a particular drug smuggling network. If there is a drug network that is dominated by older males, they might be highly susceptible to dying at a greater rate than the foot soldiers. So are we going to see changes in leadership? This is in some ways more, even more dramatic for militant groups than for criminal groups. But oftentimes younger narcos, younger criminals tend to be far more violent. They tend to often not have great negotiation skills. Often their only socialization is through violence. Mexico is a classic example of where a move toward younger and younger leadership is one element that has turned Mexico into a terribly violent market. Another dimension of that is what happens with criminal networks that have the leadership in prison. Prison is obviously a place where the crowding is similar to crowding in slums. In many prisons of the world, in Brazil, in Central America, prison conditions are horrific under the best of circumstances. There is no sanitation, no access to medical care, terrible overcrowding. Same is incidentally true about prisons in Pakistan or Indonesia or India. So if COVID comes there and wipes out the gang leadership in prison, is that going to rupture the prison street gangs as we know it? Is this going to lead to a splintering of Maras Salvatrucha and Calle 80 in Central America? Is this going to halt the spread of Primeiro Comando in Brazil, of PCC, not just in Brazil, but in Latin America? Is it going to lead to fragmentation? That's the leadership changes as a result of COVID. Fragmentation or consolidation of groups are one of the dimensions to watch with respect to coronavirus.
Thank you. Another question from our online audience. How will this pandemic impact terrorist organizations, especially their ability to finance terror attacks?
Interesting question. In the immediate turn, obviously, everyone has lost money. The global economy is in dire straits, experiencing significant downslide and potentially global recession, perhaps inevitably global recession. That also means less donations for terrorist organizations. Even today, many terrorist organizations, principally the largest part of their income is from fundraising from individual donations or donations from corporations. To the extent that they rely significantly on extortion, that might also be tough because businesses will not have money to pay bribes. That might then intensify reliance on contraband and illicit crops, but again, that means that they would have to be able to resolve how to move contraband in the context of lockdown and restrictions. So in the short term, you can say that financing is likely going to decline unless they can get heavily into very sophisticated, very large online fraud, being able to rob hundreds of billions of dollars from banks. Other dimension of that, of course, are some of the similar ones I mentioned. Take the militant group like the Taliban in Afghanistan. Much of the leadership is men in their 60s or 70s that do not necessarily maintain social distancing. What would happen if much of the Taliban leadership, or for that matter, Afghan political leaders, died of coronavirus? Would the younger commanders who are currently militant middle-level commanders, would they be more intransigent, much more bloodthirsty? Would that ease negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban? Or take a group like Al-Shabaab in Somalia that lost the country to a large extent because of how it acted in the 2011 famine, how it were not willing to permit humanitarian aid that alienated the population to a large extent. Will they have learned anything? Will they now be more tolerant of humanitarian coming in if coronavirus comes to Somalia? And with significant economic downturn, would that produce much more susceptibility of people to be recruited or at least sympathetic when they see governments failing in providing for their daily needs, when they need to make excruciating choices as to which child to save and which child to let die of disease or starvation? Final dimension of the terrorist impact or impact on terrorist groups is in the West, a lot of people are locked down. In places like India, a lot of people are locked down, are supposed to be at home, and people are, of course, bored and spending lots of time online. is that going to produce enhanced recruiting online, whether for criminal groups, street gangs, gangs like the Maras, other pandillas, or not? Is that going to produce increased recruiting for terrorist groups or not? One would hope that coronavirus will stimulate solidarity, and we're talking in this program about crime and criminality, but the other face of coronavirus is also great solidarity. Solidarity in some of the toughest, most unexpected situations. In Afghanistan, where very poor shopkeepers are turning their tailor shops into producing face masks and handing it out for free to fellow Afghans, where landlords are waiving rents for several months. So the online space could be a dangerous time for recruitment, but it could also be time to stimulate solidarity and other regarding behavior.
Absolutely. Another online question: how are intelligence services and law enforcement agencies adapting to this unique environment? And especially if more crime is committed online, do they have the bandwidth and the capabilities to address that at this time?
Well, the answer obviously will not be uniform. Different law enforcement and intelligence agencies have different investments in online presence. In places like the United States, Russia, China, the level of online policing, monitoring, intelligence activities is obviously far greater than in a place like Kenya, Tanzania, or for that matter, Guyana. And the big question here really is how much bandwidth law enforcement agencies have to switch to any domain. There are quite substantial constraints on that. It's one thing to recognize that the hotspot for criminality is this neighborhood and shift the patrols from this neighborhood to another neighborhood. It's quite another adaptation to make the jump from street patrolling to online capacity. So getting law enforcement quickly beefed up online is not something that can be done easily, particularly if the initial baseline to start with is limited. But we also have to remember that coronavirus will be over. The pandemic will be over. So life will return on the streets. That means that lots of the reallocations and changes in focus that are taking place will need to adjust back. So those are very hard decisions for law enforcement to say, we have been putting 30% of our budget toward online, and we are now going to switch to 80%. This will have massive repercussions, not for the next 6 months, but potentially for the 6 years. So those judgments need to be made very carefully, and much as we need to adapt to the immediate, we also have to bear in mind that things will swing back. The immediate is not what will be the case a year from now.
Absolutely. What can ordinary citizens do now to mitigate the growth of illicit economies?
Thank you for that question. So one is to take basic precautions from predatory crime that one would take on the street. So we know that if you are an easy victim, that might tempt some people to criminality, so lock your car. So the equivalent of that for activity online. Make sure that you have passwords on banking accounts, on anything that involves your credit cards, and any kind of online delivery, and make sure the password is not your name, your date of birth, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Be very careful about online fraud, the typical scams that ask citizens, particularly elderly people, to provide their activity, claiming that they will get some sort of support. I think one crime to watch for online is the availability of packages, of relief packages, relief economic packages, saying if you make less than X amount of money, you will get $1,000. Provide this online information, really verify that to the extent that such support is available, this is coming from legitimate sources. This is not a way to raid your bank. I would say those are in the immediate, the most pertinent and most concrete steps to take.
And in your remarks, you mentioned poaching and the illegal wildlife trade, especially with the concerns that COVID-19 may have been transmitted from an animal to a human host. Do you think there will be a major push to shut down wildlife markets around the world?
Well, thank you. And this actually also ties to the previous question. The other answer I was going to give as I took my breath was do not rely on quack potions. Traditional Chinese medicine often has bogus claim. Products that are made out of keratin, rhino horn is like chewing your nails. It's not going to cure coronavirus. Do not buy bear bile to cure coronavirus, to cure cancers, to cure other dimensions. So just stay away from what is not scientifically proven. Stay away from traditional Chinese medicines. Both limit your online presence and hence susceptibility to fraud. You help suppress wildlife trafficking and poaching and protect the global ecosystems. And I started my remarks by saying that coronavirus should be a wake-up call for us and should result in very significant curtailing of consumption of wildlife products, like traditional Chinese medicines, like wild meat. This is not available for all populations. You have poor populations in forest areas, in rural areas that need to rely on consuming wild meat for daily survival. Obviously, we don't want them to be eating gorillas, primates, and chimpanzees, both because we want to protect those species, but also because they might be sources of Ebola outbreaks or Marburg fever, other hemorrhaging fever outbreaks. But we need to recognize that they might have to rely on consumption of antelopes or deer, for example. But nonetheless, coronavirus should urge us to move away from unsustainable, dangerous consumption of wildlife products, away from poaching and wildlife trafficking. But I fear that it will not. I fear that you have the immediate shock factor that's taking place, the immediate economic consequences right now for the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And then the memory of the horrors that the pandemic caused will dissipate. People unfortunately tend to change their behavior most significantly when they face short-term, immediate, concrete steps, and when the risks are very alive in their mind. But as time goes away, they tend to stop remembering what they need to avoid. So we have seen that, for example, with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where before antiretrovirals were available, people became much more focused and diligent about using condoms. When antiretrovirals became significantly available, the rate of infection went significantly up again because people thought, well, my life will not end, I will be able to have antiretroviral. We have seen similar diminishment of the public health awareness with respect to cigarettes, with many more young people initiating the use of cigarettes because they downplay the long-term risks, because they want to avoid being fat. The immediate concern is, will I be overweight and not be dating, as opposed to will I cause cancer to myself or to others? And so I feel that something similar can happen with the pandemic unless very diligent, very consistent messaging and other efforts to suppress demand really are mounted from this level forward. And one of the big takeaways, hopefully for policymakers, is to realize that wildlife trafficking and poaching are not matters of very limited significance. For a long time, for decades, governments have spent far more effort to suppress the drug trade, illegal drug trade, than focus on wildlife trafficking. The effect of coronavirus is what no illicit drug has caused so far. So we now need to realize that any kind of situation where zoogenic diseases can emerge really needs to be elevated to the very forefront of national security, international policy priorities, and poaching and wildlife trafficking are one of those dimensions. And it will be all the tough, as I mentioned, because it requires combating against very powerful, very entrenched vested interests, such as the global pharmacological industry that peddles traditional Chinese and other wildlife potions.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. To our audience, thank you very much for tuning in, and I would again like to thank you.
Very much my pleasure.